Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks for being with us today, the day before Election Day. So we made it. I'm joined this afternoon by University of Florida's Michael McDonald, who runs their election lab and always one of the foremost experts on early voting in the country. I know I use his site all the time, especially to get all the voter turnout data. We've had Michael on the show before, so Michael, welcome back.
Great to be with you again.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking a couple minutes at your time. Early voting is just about to end, though, so all of that craziness of the last few weeks can start to wrap up. So you were posting this morning that it looks like about 78 million Americans, and who knows, probably different as of this afternoon, have already voted in the election. How does that stack up compared to prior years? And in particular, one thing I'm really curious about is what's the percentage of overall votes that are going to come via early voting? Because it's really just such a difference from prior years. So what are you seeing so far?
Well, that last question's the big question. We don't know the answer to it yet until we actually see the election day vote. So we have to make some educated guesses at this point as to what's going on with the early vote, what we expect to happen on election day, and then it will get us at an overall turnout. Tempted to do that last night as best as I can, but there are some moving parts here to understand. So let's get the top line numbers. We have 78 million that's have voted so far. We'll probably end up somewhere around 88, 90 million. It will be fewer than 2020 in the pandemic. So didn't expect to repeat having 2/3 of the votes cast early, half of them by mail, which is what happened in 2020. And so, that's not a surprise. We already know there's not enough mail ballot requests to even match the 2020 total mail ballot. So we know that early voting was going to be down for mail balloting. And so the in-person, there's a different story going on there. We'll talk about it, I'm sure. And then for the overall forecast, looks like it's going to be around 158 million people voting, give or take. And then that would get you a turnout rate of those who are eligible around 64%. So higher turnout rate than we saw even in 2008, where we had about 62%, but it won't be that same 66% that we had in 2020, which was the highest turnout rate since 1900.
Yeah, so that's the turnout rate being around 66%. And what the percentage of that comes early, that's a lot different than, like, say, the 2000 vote or 2004 vote. Was 2020 really the inflection point, or was there already a push before that election for voters to cast a ballot before election day itself?
We've been on this steady increase of people using early voting from election cycle to election cycle. There are two factors. One is that, states make early voting available, so more people can do it.
Right.
But once a state adopts early voting, you'll see more people using it over time within that state. Best example of this would be like a state like Washington, where they had this permanent absentee ballot list. And eventually they just threw in the towel and said, we're just going to go vote by mail because no one's voting on election day anymore. So it's a waste of our resources. So that's the general trend. We're already starting to see this, say, in Michigan, where almost 2 million people have signed up for their new permanent absentee ballot list. And you're just going to expect numbers going to grow over time if the experience in any of the other states is a leading indicator of what's going to happen there. So we've seen an increase of early voting. What the wrinkle this cycle is, we got the two wrinkles. One's the mail ballots. We knew there's going to be fewer of those. And those are primarily Democrats who were voting by mail and continue to vote by mail. The wrinkle is with the in-person early vote. Typically before 2020, we would have said, that's where the Democrats are voting. They don't vote by mail. That's where the Republicans vote. And then in 2020, that got turned on its head with all those Democrats leaving the in-person early vote and voting by mail. So suddenly the in-person early vote looked much more Republican than it did in the past. So now Republicans think, hey, maybe that's for us. And 2020, Trump's saying all early votes fraudulent because, you look in the past and it looks fraudulent to them because it's more Democrats are voting early. But in 2020, with this change in the method by which people were voting, opens the door for Trump this cycle to say, okay, go vote early, but do it in person. And so we're seeing large numbers of Republicans vote in person early, much higher than we've seen in any previous election. And where I can dig down into the data and I can see at least some of this are people who would have been voting on election day in the past, but now they're voting in person early. Perhaps the best example of this phenomenon comes out of Pennsylvania, where
Okay.
they don't have in-person early votes. They only have mail ballots. But in any state, you can request and cast a mail ballot at an election office. Of course, you have to be eligible, yada, yada, and there are some variations across states if you really get in the weeds. But generally, that's true. And so Republicans who have heard like, oh, no, I got to vote. If I'm going to vote early, I got to vote in person, are lining up in long lines at election offices to cast a mail ballot in person at the site. And the long lines are there not because like election officials are trying to keep people from voting. They just weren't prepared for this. They weren't expecting to have all these voters. Their system's not set up to do this sort of in-person early voting. And it's a clunky check-in process. And on top of all that, it's not like in-person early voting elsewhere where there's early voting locations and it's really easy. You go up there, you vote. Here you have a check-in process. You have to request the absentee ballot or mail ballot first, and then you get issued the mail ballot. So you restrict its supply to election offices. It's a clunky system and you end up with long lines. But last time I checked, looking at the Pennsylvania file, over 78,000 people had done this in Pennsylvania. It's just amazing how Trump can say something and people will follow what he tells them to do. And with this in-person early voting, it's definitely affecting what we think is going to happen with the overall size of the electorate. And it gets back to this question, like, well, what's the overall turnout going to be and what's the size of the early vote? I mean, the guess is like, I don't know. I mean, if we actually applied past historical patterns to the size of the early vote that we're seeing right now in some of these states, we're like way above 2020 on their turnout. So that seems implausible that we're going to have turnout above 2020, highest turnout since 1900. I guess it could happen. We could see what happens on election day. But the more plausible scenario seems to be, we're going to still have a good turnout, but it's going to be lower than it was in 2020, which means that we're going to have some of that election day vote that would have occurred in any past election. It shifted to early voting, particularly that in-person early voting. So you get like maybe 58% of the votes going to be cast early this cycle, where last election, we were still in 2022, we were still under 50%. But that kind of fits the upward trend with a jog up, kind of unexpected because of changing behavior this cycle.
The non-political thing that keeps going to mind for me is Black Friday shopping around the holidays. And it used to be, if you wanted to participate in Black Friday shopping, you were going to get up at 4 a.m. and wait in a long line with your hand on the door to get in. And then, two things really shifted that. One is the introduction of online Black Friday shopping, but then also all the various days that started to come in 1 week earlier, 2 weeks earlier, 6 weeks earlier. So just spread that out, right? So essentially it's lowering the cost of participating in that. And I do wonder, if there's some, reasonably sized voter block that used to think, I don't really want to wait in line for 2 hours on election day, but I will go on a Thursday a week before that for 18 minutes. Are we at the early precipice of that having a big impact in the overall turnout? Because are we lowering the costs of participation? I don't know, have you done any data research behind that?
Yeah, well, there's a debate in academia about whether or not early voting increases turnout as a convenience factor. I think it does, but at least with the in-person early voting, there's research that says that it doesn't really have an effect. It just is a change of whether or not they're actually going to vote. But for mail balloting, I just published a paper earlier this year that does find a strong correlation, at least put it this way, between access to mail ballots, the usage of mail ballots, and turnout within a state. So it may be that mail ballots are the key. And if you look back in the history, the literature, there's mixed findings on, but no one ever says that mail ballots decreases. They either say, in this case, it didn't have much of an effect, or in other cases, it did have an. So we come down on the side that, it looks like it has a positive effect. The in-person early voting, I still think is a convenience factor. We can find evidence of it. We can look at, say, like in 2020 in Florida, we had a presidential preference primary underway. And in the midst of that, where there was early voting occurring, it's hard to believe this, but Governor DeSantis actually did issue emergency orders and we shut down all the universities. And so students left in the middle of the early voting period. And you can actually see early voting was going on, in-person early voting. And then the day the evacuation order happens, drops off to nothing. That's not surprising. There's a little bump back up on election day, but not a lot. Maybe some students were still around living with their friends or something off campus. So it looks like, when you look at these people who were affected by an emergency situation, early voting offered a safety valve for them to participate. And this is going to be relevant also to similar work that my colleague Dan Smith has done with some of our students as well, where we look at the effect of hurricanes on turnout. And again, early voting becomes a safety valve there. It will probably be after this election cycle, once we see what happens with Hurricane Helene, that it helped people to vote in Southern Appalachia and the Big Bend area of Florida that were devastated by that hurricane. And so we can find examples where in-person early voting does seem to offer convenience to help people vote where they might not otherwise be able to.
Yeah, I always hear, here in prior years, you'd always hear about the snowstorms and some of the northern states that might impact people's voting patterns on election day itself. And then kind of makes you wonder if in future years, would you see something like, oh, it looks like a snowstorm's coming on Tuesday, we'll go vote on Sunday instead, or something to that effect, more choice.
And this was the original rationale for in-person early voting, because at our country's founding, for the first 70 years or so, we had in-person early voting. We had voting that stretched over several days, and it was predominantly for people in rural areas who had to travel to a county courthouse because that's where you had to vote. It was to provide convenience for them to vote. And then we had that mid-1800s law that said, no, it's the first Tuesday after the first November. And you may actually wonder from a legal perspective, well, then how is it possible then that early voting is even legal? Well, that was a question that the Supreme Court wrestled with respect to Oregon and their vote by mail system. And the Supreme Court ultimately said that you can have people vote prior to Election Day. That's fine. You just can't tally the vote until Election Day.
Yep.
And the way in which election officials then have interpreted that is that you can do everything up to the point. Like you can run the ballots even through machines, counting machines, but you can't actually take that memory stick that you have that has the vote totals on it. You can't stick it in a tabulator to actually tabulate the election results until Election Day itself. And of course, this matters for whether or not different states allow their election officials lead time in processing mail ballots and in-person early votes. Most do, but of course, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin don't. And so get delays on reporting election results.
Yeah, we've got all sorts of great information on Ballotpedia if listeners want to look up all the different rules in the various states. We've got that in our help desk content. So you touched on Pennsylvania.
You guys are great.
Any other...
I love Ballotpedia.
Well, we love you too. We love your data also. We feature you a lot. So what other swing states have you been following that you've seen anything interesting come out of so far besides Pennsylvania? Anything of note as we wind down toward Election Day?
Yeah, in the past, what I do is I try to, I project out the turnout. We've already had that discussion. But I do try to use the early vote where I can to forecast who's going to win. And I've only done this now for 2 states, and there's some just the different shifting patterns on when people are voting are really messing with this approach.
Yeah, new variable. Yeah.
So like in Georgia, it looks like, the profile of the electorate looks a lot similar to 2020, which is a very close election, but we don't have party registration in Georgia. So we might have gotten a stronger signal out of Georgia. So my best guess out of Georgia is it looks similar to 2020. Who knows who's going to win there? North Carolina, in both 2016 and 2020, I called that state using the analysis I do for Trump. And I turned out to be right. The polls were wrong in those years. Mm-hmm. This year, the polls are a lot closer than they were. And the early vote looks pretty good, darn good for him in North Carolina. So, by using the analysis, I have to say, I've already published it. It looks like Trump's going to win North Carolina. But then we get into so whenever there's polling differences and then the early vote, then I said well, why could we be getting these differences? And there are some plausible scenarios of what could be happening here. The shift of the timing, that seems to matter. We can actually see evidence of that. We can also see an unusual number, well, not really unusual, it's actually typical number of women voting. It's the unusual Republicans voting that kind of is a head scratcher, because if you expect Republicans to be more often men, and yet we have more Republicans voting, but we don't have a gender change in the gender distribution really, that would be commensurate with what we're seeing with the change in party registration. So there's some head scratchers, and you look at it and go Republican women are still outpacing Republican men voting in North Carolina. So is gender gap going to be significant? And if you believe the Selzer poll out of Iowa, then you would say, maybe there's something to that. Because a lot of these early voters are older women, and that's what Selzer says is how she could get to a Harris win in Iowa. We'll see if that comes to pass. But there's still this underlying dynamic, which could be really important. Iowa may not be won by Harris, but if older women, conservative women are abandoning Trump, then that could be significant. And then the other dynamic is we've got a lot of unaffiliated voting in North Carolina. And that a lot more than in past elections. North Carolina is one of these semi-closed states. So it could be that what we're observing here and the differences, partisan differences, really is like a lot of Democrats who changed the party registration to unaffiliated so they could vote for Nikki Haley in the primary. That's a plausible explanation of what's going on. And there's some evidence of that going on too. So it's just like, it looks good for Trump. If you don't believe in it and you want to spin a scenario where you think Harris could still win North Carolina, it's plausible. I mean, it's not, I still think Trump most likely wins, but I can't say with certainty what's going to happen here. So who knows? And then Nevada's, because we've had all this in-person early voting, is a vote by mail state, but Republicans are voting in person. And so it's like this tortoise and hare story. And usually in the tortoise and the hare, it's the Democrats being the hare, jumps out to a big lead and Republicans plodding along, and then they catch Democrats often on election day. This time it's weird. It's like an inverse of that in Nevada. And this is the dynamic that happened in 2022 as well. Republicans jump out to a lead, and then this mail ballot starts coming, and it breaks towards the Democrats. And you have to understand, Nevada is one of these states where it's a postmark by state,
right,
meaning that ballots that are postmarked by election day, they're accepted by election officials for up to 4 days following the election.
Yeah.
So we could be seeing tens of thousands of ballots coming in after election day. And it's this sort of plodding tortoise that could overtake Trump. So if we see a lead for Trump, but it's a narrow lead in Nevada on election night, my guess is the networks are not going to call Nevada. They're going to want to see what's going on with that mail ballots. If Harris has a lead with the vote that is reported on election night, I think there's going to be some more confidence for the networks to call it. But even then, if it's like close enough within the margin, they may wait around for a little while to see what's going on. And when I say they, I really mean we, because I do work on a decision desk.
Yeah. Well, there's a heck of a lot of variables for everyone to keep their eye on over the next 24 hours and beyond that. So we'll have to have you back on. And once the dust settles and we can look back on the certified results and see what the voter turnout actually looked like and see what that tells us. So.
Yeah, I'm kind of like a cicada that pops up every 2 years. Around when election time happens.
Yeah, well, this is one of those double cicada that happened this year, right? This was like the double cicada all at once cycle. So yeah, we like to think of it sometimes as, the family that goes out to dinner once a year at a restaurant. They're merging to come out to dinner, and that's looking up information about our political system. So this should be a really interesting election, like it always is, Mike. Well, it was really great to have you on today. Appreciate you taking a couple minutes out of what I'm sure is a very busy day for you and for everyone, and keep that coffee flowing the next few days.
Yeah, I really appreciate all the work that you guys do with Ballotpedia. So thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you. And for our listeners, you can learn more about early voting at the link in our show notes. You can expect us in your feed later this week. So please subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Pallette, and thanks for listening.